Hey, everybody. We're going to give it a minute while everyone's joining us this evening before we go ahead and get started. We're going to just wait like another minute or so to see. All right, we're going to go ahead while people are still joining on. So hello, everyone, and good evening. Welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society's virtual cooking series. We're so pleased to welcome best-selling author Abra Berens to discuss her latest cookbook, Pulp, A Practical Guide to Cooking with Fruit, which she has so nicely displayed there. All of our copies have been checked out. It's very popular, as are all of your other cookbooks at the library. So I did not have a copy to
I got
demonstrate. But for everyone joining us this evening, please, anytime, feel free to ask questions. There's a Q&A section in Zoom, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. You can also purchase copies of Pulp. We have the link will be in the chat to purchase from our local independent bookstore, the Learned Owl. So that will be posted in there tonight as well. Abra's going to be demonstrating how to make a recipe, and for those of you who didn't receive it in the email, we'll also post that link. So don't worry, check the chat. We'll have all those links and stuff posted there. Now on to tonight's speaker. Abra Berens is a chef, author, and former farmer whose work aims to strengthen the bond between growers and eaters. She's the author of 2 previous award-winning cookbooks, Grist, A Practical Guide to Cooking with Grains, Beans, Seeds, and Legumes, which was named Best Cookbook for Fall 2021 by Eater, and Ruffage, A Practical Guide to Vegetables, which was nominated for a James Beard Award. Berens is a chef at Grainer Farm and is a certified organic farm in Three Oaks, Michigan. She was recently named a James Beard Award semifinalist for Outstanding Chef in the Great Lakes, which is amazing. Her latest book, Pulp, is the go-to resource for all things cooking with fruit, and she highlights how to regularly incorporate local fruit grown in the Midwest into meals. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Abra.
Oh my gosh. Well, thanks so much for having me, and to everyone for attending. I have a really deep love of libraries. I grew up in rural Michigan, and I still remember we had air conditioning growing up, but we only really turned it on when company was coming over. And so I remember distinctly riding my bike the 5 miles to get to our local library, which was like an air conditioned trailer next to the fire station, and just sitting in there and reading and basking in air conditioning before I would get, see the sun starting to go down and then have to truck it home in time for dinner. And so I just feel like libraries are, one of the most important community institutions and civic institutions that we have. And I'm just so grateful to be here. I've never been to your library, but I would love to come someday. So my next trip to Cleveland, I'm going to pop by and say hi.
We'd love to have you. You're welcome anytime.
Well, great. So everyone, like I said, I haven't been to your library. I don't know if you've been to my corner of Michigan, but I am going to kind of talk through the 3 cookbooks that I've written, and then focus a little bit more on Pulp, since that's the one that we're talking about today. There is a chat or a question and answer section of Zoom. So please, if you have any questions, just enter it into the Q&A, and then Alex is going to interrupt and kind of guide me through different questions as they come up. So I'm very happy for this to be conversational, so don't feel like you need to wait until the end. If you've got something, just type it while you're thinking about it. So my story starts that I grew up on a farm in in Western Michigan, kind of near Holland, Michigan. And it was my dad's town. My mom is from Southern Illinois, and we settled there because my dad went back to the farm. Both my parents were anesthesiologists, but my dad, as the first person to go to college and then to medical school in his family, heard the call to come back when his parents needed some help. And so I grew up kind of in that like duality of farming and medicine. And I didn't really realize how special growing up in a farming family or growing up rurally was until I moved away. I think a lot of people feel that way. But I moved to the University of Michigan, and where I went to college, and then started working at Zingerman's Deli, which is kind of a world-renowned food institution, both food and customer service. And, I really found a home there. And that's where I started cooking. Roger Bowser, who's now the managing partner of Zingerman's Deli, along with Rick Stretz and Grace Singleton, really took me under his wing and taught me how to cook. And, I started out taking orders and running trays of sandwiches out to people. And then over my 5 years there, started cooking. And I bring that up only because it's notable that that's, where you can get a foothold somewhere, but also because Roger was starting to bring in local produce to Zingerman's, which is a very high volume, fast paced business, which is not notoriously the best place for local produce to really shine. And he wanted to, start to showcase these things that were grown in our area. And that was so eye-opening to me because I had grown up around locally grown produce, but I never really thought much about it. And so all of a sudden I was seeing things I had never seen before, like these beautiful chicories and speckled romaines and, tomatoes that were all different colors and things like that. And so I really started kind of paying attention to local food and seeing the connection to agriculture and restaurants in a way that I never had before. And then I went from Zingerman's to a cooking school in Ireland called Ballymaloe. Ballymaloe is in Cork, County Cork, so southern, like eastern side of Ireland. And it is situated on a 100-acre working organic farm. And that school is very different from most cooking schools. It's a 12-week program. There are only 50 students at the time. There are only 50 students there. And really you're teaching, or where we were taught kind of an idea about cooking, this closeness to the land, and also very simple food made with great ingredients and prepared in a way that was convivial, and really meant to bring people together around a table. And it was at cooking school that I realized I had an opportunity as someone who understood a bit about agriculture to try to carve out a niche in the food world that was connecting people who don't spend that much time with growers to how their food is made. And I'm sort of fascinated by the statistic that I learned recently, which is that 100 years ago, 30% of America's population were farmers, and today it's about 3%. And Ohio is a great agricultural state as well. And so it's interesting to realize, even in these states that are known for agriculture and the great things that we grow, fewer and fewer people are interacting with farmers, which there's lots of reasons for that, and there's lots of outcomes of that. But the one I'm the most interested in is that if you don't know someone's work, or you're not exposed to it, it's hard to empathize with it. And so I think we're losing some of the knowledge base of what it takes to get food to market. And so that's kind of been my North Star. I saw when I started vegetable farming after I moved back from Ireland, I wanted to start a restaurant on a farm. And so I started farming with my friend Jess, and we were, growing things, and then I would turn them into these menus. And I saw kind of firsthand how long it takes to get a head of garlic. It takes 9 months. You plant, at least in Michigan, you plant it in October and then harvest it in usually July of the next year. And I put garlic in just about everything. So it seemed like really remarkable that there was that much time for things to go wrong and to lose your crop, but also just that you wouldn't have garlic necessarily. So While I was in Northport, Michigan, I started writing a food column for the local paper. Like libraries, I think our local media is a really important institution. For me, it was important because it gave me a way to start doing this work that I love, which is food writing. And so I started writing a column every other week about the things that we were growing and how I was cooking with them, what it meant to have them on the farm, different things like that. And so out of that column, I was able to write my first cookbook, which is called Ruffage. I didn't plan ahead and I don't have a copy of it here, but it's all about vegetables. And the idea for me was to try to create a book that was the book that I needed in 2009 when I was starting to cook on the farm, but I was still a super green cook. And I was using traditional cookbooks like Nigel Slater's Tender or Chez Panisse Vegetables, but I was also using books like the Flavor Bible or Mind of a Chef or things like that were more esoteric, kind of just flavor combinations. And so what Ruffage is, it started the Practical Guide series, which is what we call these 3 books. Each chapter is a vegetable. And then I like to say it's almost like an NCAA bracket in reverse. So you start with the winner and then you get the different preparation techniques. So asparagus, and then you can have it raw, roasted, grilled, or poached. And then from there's a recipe that has, asparagus with garlic, herb, butter, and capers or something like that. But you could also have that with something like, an egg salad or hollandaise or different things like that. So you can just kind of swap out the things that go with the roasted asparagus and have it present as a very different dish, even though structurally it's functioning the same way. And I think for me, that is what I learned in restaurant kitchens, that there is this structure of technique and preparation that on which you kind of build your dishes. And that goes all the way through about 30 different vegetables. After I was done writing Ruffage, there's always kind of this time when you can't edit the book anymore, but it's not yet in print. And so it's a very nerve-wracking time. And I have found that myself, and I've learned from other authors that they often do the same thing. You can kind of channel your nervous energy into a new project. So I enjoyed making Ruffage so much that I wanted to do it again. So I started talking with my editor at Chronicle, Sarah Billingsley, about working on another project. And I had always wanted to write Pulp. I thought, fruits and veggies, they go together. Michigan grows a ton of fruit because of our proximity to Lake Michigan. We have to get 8 servings a day. I know people only ever talk about vegetables. Well, what about all this fruit? And so I started talking to her about that. And she said, nope, fruit books don't sell. Nobody buys a fruit cookbook. All you do is eat it. And I was like, oh, okay, interesting. And then she said, do you have any other ideas? And I had just started working at Grainer Farm, which is in Southwest Michigan. We are about 90 miles from Chicago. And we started primarily as a vegetable farm, and I was hired to put in a dining program for the farm. And at the same time that I was starting to build this program, Wesley Reith was starting to build our grain program. It started as about 4 acres of rye to distill into whiskey and has grown to just about 400 acres of a variety of different small grains, including or extending to heirloom corn, edible beans, oats and barley and wheat, all different types of wheat, things like that. And so I was suddenly using all of these new ingredients. So I said to my editor and said, well, I'm cooking a lot with grains and beans. And she lit up and was like, I've always wanted to do a grains and beans cookbook. Let's do that. So that's how Grist came about. It is the same structure as Ruffage, the vegetable book. It is primarily a savory cooking book. It is not a baking book. And it's through the lens of vegetables and legumes and grains. And then because she wanted to do the grain book and I really wanted to do the fruit book, we kind of compromised and said, well, let's do both. And so after writing Grist, I went straight into doing the work on Pulp. And for all of these books, there's a recipe and then there's lots of different variations. So you can get substitutions. And if you don't have feta, maybe you can use cheddar, different things like that. Well, with the fruit book, it felt like that was going to be kind of overkill, a little heavy-handed. And people love baking with fruit. And we hadn't really done much baking in any of these books until now. And so in Pulp, it's the same thing. Each chapter is a fruit. There's different preparation techniques like raw, roasted, stewed, poached, things like that. And then there's a savory recipe and a sweet recipe. So today we're going to do the sweet recipe for roasted strawberries, which is a Dutch baby. At the beginning of Pulp, there's about 100 different baking recipes that are things like cakes and batter doughs and custards and cookie recipes and bread recipes, all the things that I use over the years to showcase fruit. I'm not a natural baker who wants to spend, an entire weekend making like the perfect opera tart. That's not me. And so I have collected these recipes from a lot of folks that I've worked with in restaurants over the years. And they're very simple and they showcase different fruit throughout the whole season. So this recipe is a Dutch baby, which is one of my favorite desserts. And you can make it savory too, so the batter can go both ways. But I always forget about it because they seem so grand, but they really take 20 minutes, a bowl and a whisk, and that's it. And so this one, it's a Dutch baby, and then you roast the strawberries while the Dutch baby is cooking. And so the reason for that is that sometimes you have strawberries that taste great. You don't need to do anything else with it. But sometimes they're like a little bit rougher around the edges or not super flavorful. You can roast them and concentrate the flavor. And since you've got the oven on for the Dutch baby, we're going to roast the strawberries at the same time. The counter recipe in the book is a grilled lamb chop with roasted strawberries and mustard and black pepper and arugula. So that's kind of how it swings both sweet and savory. So with that, I'm going to get started on cooking all of these things, and I'll kind of give little talks and tips along the way. But if there's any questions, again, please enter them into the chat. Alex will interrupt me and we'll just talk and cook together. Great. Alex, did anything come in? Anything I need to answer right away?
We have one that came in. I also put the link if you want to check out the work that's being done at Grainer Farm, because I was going on the website and stuff before, and it's amazing all of the different things going on. And so I put the link in the chat. So if you're interested, please check it out. It sounds amazing. Carolyn would like to know, when you were developing recipes for Pulp, did any fruit surprise you?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I was surprised by there's a whole chapter called tart round fruit, which are things like cranberries, gooseberries, lingonberries, autumn olive, things like that. That kind of get used the same way in that they're pretty tart. They have a similar texture, and they can be used lots of different ways. And I found that those were some of my favorites for the savory cooking, because that acidity lends itself so much to the to pairing with savory items richer meats like those lamb chops I was mentioning, or things like cheeses. Anything that's creamy and rich is going to benefit from that kind of jolt of acidity too. So yeah, I'll keep thinking about it though, and kind of talking about it through the way. So this recipe is very straightforward. You can write it down while you're watching this and then make it anytime. And so I've got my bowl. We're going to put into the bowl 3 eggs. So these are just average eggs. They're a little bit of all different sizes because I get them from my neighbor, but any egg will do. So it doesn't even matter. Sometimes people get jumbos, sometimes people get larges, any of them are fine. And then into the bowl are 3 eggs, as well as a half a cup of milk. And you can use oat milk as well. We've had more people at the farm lately who are avoiding dairy. So something like oat milk or even a soy milk would probably work. I don't tend to use soy milk quite as much because I don't prefer the flavor. I prefer the flavor of oat milk, but everybody has a different palate. I also just put in a half a cup of all-purpose flour. I'm using just straight ahead King Arthur. I can show you the label. Their all-purpose flour. I really love their stuff, and you can find it in any grocery store. Bob's Red Mill also makes a great all-purpose flour. There's also a tablespoon of sugar and a pinch of salt. And the sugar, you can leave that sugar out if you're avoiding sugar, because it really just helps with the browning and lends a little bit of sweetness to it. It's sort of like how over the years I've made a lot of donuts, and donut dough often doesn't have very much sugar in it. It has just enough to make it brown a little bit while it's frying, but the sweetness really comes from the glaze or the filling or something like that, or the sugar that you dust on the outside. And so because you're usually topping it with something like that, the dough itself isn't very sweet. And that's the same as with this Dutch baby dough. So this is literally as complicated as it gets. You have to whisk it for a little bit. There's, because of the volume of eggs and liquid, you don't really have to worry about overworking it. And so I just whisk it until all of the lumps are gone, which can be kind of any, depending. My flour is a little bit lumpy because it's been humid here the last couple of days. But that's what the dough or the batter looks like. It's very loose. It's pretty golden because of those eggs. And that's really what you're looking for. The secret to this recipe and for the speed of it is right now I've got my oven on to 425. So it bakes at a higher temp than most people are usually comfortable with. The reason for that is it really gets that kind of big puff and round bowl of the Dutch baby. That's the classic shape for it. So to speed it along and to be sure you've got that nice hot surface, when I turn the oven on, I put 2 frying pans in the oven. We're going to do one for the Dutch baby. The other one is going to roast the strawberries. And so right now I've got my pans in there. So I'm going to grab them out. And I tend to use a cast iron pan just because it's what I have. You can use anything that you want. I made a one as a, to have the backup in case I get nervous and this one becomes a horrible failure. I've got one that I made earlier to be sure that I'd have something to show you. That one is in just a regular stainless steel pan. And you can see by putting the hot butter into the pan, and it was cut up into a couple of little pieces for ease of melting, I'm just swirling it around until most of that butter has melted. It's about 3 tablespoons. So it's a little bit of butter to it, and part of what that does is it ensures that you have enough fat that it's gonna not stick. It also helps with the browning and makes sure that it stands up really tall. So this is what it is. The batter goes into the pan. It'll start to cook a little bit immediately right around the edge. We're going to transfer it, put it straight away back into the oven. And I think the real thing about Dutch babies is that it always feels like they're not going to work. I was saying this to Alex earlier that even when I was whisking this up at 6:30 getting ready for this, I was like, put it into the pan, put it into the oven. I was like, this is never going to work, and they just become this magical thing. So, take your time, don't look at it, don't fret, just let it sit in there and it'll do its thing. And then simultaneously, so this is when, if I'm ever feeling nervous about it, this is usually when I pour myself a glass of wine, take the dog for a walk, just keep your mind sort of active in other ways so that you don't worry about your Dutch baby in the oven. After you've calmed your nerves, then you can get your second pan out of the oven. And this is also a cast iron frying pan that's been in there. I've got a little bit of stuff that came off, it's been in there for about an hour, just because I was nervous and I wanted to get ahead. I'm going to take a little bit, this is neutral, just olive or a cooking oil. I tend to use grapeseed. You could use vegetable, canola, soy, any of those things that you want. And I just put a fair amount in just to get it again so that it doesn't stick. You'll see it's starting to smoke a little bit. That means our pan is nice and hot. I'm going to take some strawberries here. And you can hear the sizzle of it. I'm going to put them right back into the oven. And what that does is because you've got about 20 minutes until the Dutch baby is ready, it won't take necessarily that whole time for the fruit to cook, but that way it's cooking just straight in the oven. You don't have to stand over the stove. Give it 5 or 6 minutes before you even look at it. Mostly when you cook with fruit, you want it to be hot and fast. If you're trying to get like a nice sear on it, or if you're trying to concentrate those juices. If you're doing something like you're baking it or poaching it, then you can go at a lower temperature, like 350 or something like that. But if you're doing it in the oven or on a grill, hot and fast is good because you want to get that really nice sear, caramelize those sugars before all of the cells in the fruit kind of break and lose their juices. This is also a great way, like I was saying earlier, to use kind of subpar strawberries. I think we've all had that issue where you wait and you wait and you wait for strawberry season in the northern Midwest, and then it comes and you have a bite and it has just rained a ton and the strawberries just taste so flat and it's such a bummer. And so that's where I like to use something like this where you can kind of concentrate that flavor. And we're going to add a little bit of vinegar to it to give it some extra acidity and extra boost and to loosen it from the pan. If they're really not great strawberries, you could add a little bit of sugar too, or maple syrup is usually really beautiful to add to something like this. Also, you should know that I used frozen strawberries for this. It's not yet strawberry season in our area. We have a great food hub in our, just a couple, again, an hour north of us, who gathers all sorts of fruit at the peak of harvest and individually freezes it. So I usually have a bag of frozen fruit in my freezer for the winter time, and you can roast them down and they're going to function very similarly. I do like to keep, if I'm using frozen fruit for this application, I will usually keep it frozen. And again, the reason for that is so that it has more time to really sear and cook without collapsing. Strawberries are, I think, actually like a pretty difficult fruit to work with. They're so good, they're so ethereal, but if they're not great raw, sometimes they have a lot of moisture in them. That can be kind of hard to balance. I think, I've made more than one strawberry pie that has just been like soup. And so I really try to avoid those disasters more than once if I can help it. So nice hot pan, a little bit of oil. The oil not only helps keep it from sticking, but the oil is going to be hotter than the air around the strawberry. So it will actually cook it a bit faster, and it adds a little bit of richness to it too. So while those are in there, I'm going to put these in this thing.
We have a couple questions if you have time.
Great. Yes.
All right. Iris would like to know, what size skillet do you recommend for the Dutch baby?
It says in the book, let me look real quick. I usually just grab my medium size one. I have a small, medium, and large. It's probably about a 9-inch. But let me just look up the recipe and see if I can find it. This is always like the hardest time when you're trying to find something on the spot. But yeah, I think I usually do. This says a large frying pan. So I would say that I was told during the cooking process that my large frying pan is significantly larger than most. So I remember measuring it, and it was a 9 or a 10-inch frying pan. And I can show you too, I'll give you guys the big reveal ahead of time. So this is the one that I made earlier. So that's my kind of medium. I wish I had a measuring tape, but I think it's in the other room. And then like this is my small frying pan. So let me see if I can hold up the difference. It's a little hard to tell over the computer, but that's definitely the size difference. So I would say medium to large. It's not super important for the dish itself. But what it is that you want it to be big enough that it doesn't overflow. And, but also the bigger it is, the more the batter has to spread over across the surface area, so there won't be as much to go up the sides. I've never had a Dutch baby actually overflow, because you can see what it does is it creates this like bowl to it, and it'll be more dramatic when it comes out of the oven fresh. Because of the 3 eggs, it's a little bit like a souffle, where it's going to come out super tall, and as it sits, it will collapse back down a little bit. There's no way to avoid that, although I've actually never tested this with a Dutch baby. It works with a souffle, where you can bake your souffles. Souffles are not as like persnickety as everyone thinks that they are. You can bake them, and when they come out, they're going to have that nice loft. If you let them cool, they're going to drop in their height. But what you can do, like for a dinner party, or we do this at the restaurant all the time, is that you put it back into the oven and it will rise again. It won't be as dramatic, so it's not quite as perfect, but it's still very stunning, and it helps kind of balance. Again, I do not recommend doing souffles for a dinner party if you are really tied to the height of them being the benchmark for your success. I think we make souffle all the time at home just for dinner, because we usually have eggs, flour, milk, and cheese on hand. And so it becomes kind of a quick, Wednesday night meal, and we just do it in a casserole dish. And then that way it's sort of more like a spoon bread than it is like a traditional like frou-frou French thing. And so, but you can do it for a dinner party, bake them ahead of time, pop them back in the oven, and they will lift again a little bit. But because of that, I'm going to try it with this Dutch baby, and we're going to learn together as a group.
That's exciting. See if it works.
And
Oh,
the
we have
other,
another.
oh, go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, so now you can see our strawberries, they've released some of their liquid. And so I'm going to put them back into the oven to continue to concentrate that liquid down. I'm also going to add a little bit of vinegar. And this is just like a standard store-bought balsamic vinegar. I think the recipe calls for like a 1/4 cup. This is something I don't really measure. I just kind of glug it. If you don't have balsamic vinegar, more and more grocery stores are carrying something like a sherry vinegar. That's nice. Red wine vinegar. Even like a good apple cider vinegar will work. Something along those lines. And what that does again is it's just going to mix with those juices and add a little bit of tartness. Something like a balsamic or a sherry has some inherent sweetness in it. And so it's kind of balancing that. There's a lot of pickled fruit recipes in the book as well. And it's that same idea. It's like vinegar and sugar to help kind of bring out those natural combos in the fruit itself. But there was another question, I think.
There was. You had mentioned something about how you had used frozen strawberries, assuming that were frozen during the last harvest season. Could you talk a bit if someone at home wanted to do that process themselves?
Oh, sure. Freezing
Storage.
fruit is very easy. Some things I don't generally do anything except for wash it and take the stems off. Some people will blanch things like peaches or nectarines if they want to take the skins off. I don't really bother generally. And so I usually just give them a quick rinse, let them dry a little bit, and then I lay them onto a cookie sheet, either with parchment paper or even just plastic wrap, or there's these great things called silicone baking mats, which I've started to use now in place of parchment because they're reusable, so I don't have to like throw them out all the time. So I just lay that down, lay the fruit on top of it in a single layer, and then put it into my freezer. And that's called in the kind of restaurant world, that would be called IQF, or individually quick frozen. That usually is done in a like blast chiller that can bring it down super fast. It works just as well in my own fridge for my own purposes. So I let them freeze overnight. And then the next day I take the tray out, and working kind of quickly because you don't want them to thaw again. I just scoop everything up into like a zipper freezer bag, label it, put it back in the freezer. And the reason I do it that way, as opposed to just putting them all into the bag to start with, is that if you do that, 9 times out of 10, they're going to freeze as kind of a giant lump. And then you have to take the whole lump out to use it, or like try to cleave at it with your knife, which is like sort of disastrous at times. And so this way you can grab just a handful of frozen berries. You know, I put it on oatmeal or over yogurt, or I also, again, bake with them a lot in the winter. So one of the recipes in the book is my favorite cobbler recipe. And some people have said it's not a cobbler, it's a slump or a grunt. I learned it as cobbler. Again, I'm from Michigan. I'm probably offending everyone from Ohio. But it is a cup of flour, a cup of sugar, a cup of milk, and a tablespoon of baking powder. And in a baking pan, you just toss the fruit together, put it in the bottom, pour the batter over the top, and then it makes like a thick, kind of like a pancake batter. And then you dot butter, especially in the corners, so that it gets nice and golden brown and crunchy. Bake it, and then that fruit will just break down, and all of those juices get kind of sucked up by the cobbler topping. So it's like a really kind of fluffy, crunchy topping with all of this warm fruit underneath. And I love it with frozen peaches and frozen blueberries. To me, it's indistinguishable from summer fruit. That was a very long-winded answer to your question.
No, but it was very helpful. So that was fantastic. Thank you.
Good. Yeah, and I think that there's more and more places that are doing, you know, good local fruit preservation. I think that there's a lot more of these like processing kitchens and co-packers that are kind of coming up to help, you know, absorb some of that. Like agriculture is definitely a boom, you know, cycle. And so that way it kind of helps mitigate how much there is in the summer and how little there is in the winter in our area. Beyond kind of frozen berries, again, I love frozen peaches. I don't tend to use frozen apples because we have apples for so long that there's just not really a need for it. Yeah, melon is great frozen, things like that. All right, I'm gonna go check out this Dutch baby and see. It's been about 15 minutes or so, but again, it was a slightly smaller pan, so it might be ready, and it was a hotter pan than the other one. All right, so look at that. I'm gonna see if we can get really close to it. You can see how nice and tall and high it is. And you'll notice too, it's hot pan, that it is like beautiful and bubbly and round. This to me is like the perfectness. And it did kind of, you know how I said I'd never had one overflow before? Well, this one, I must have kind of an uneven oven because it all went this way and kind of came over the edge, but it stopped before it got out of control. And you can see it's already kind of dropping a little bit, but that's okay because it's going to taste just as good. So we've got our Dutch baby here, and then I'm going to check those strawberries. Our tester that we did to see if it would rise again, it does not really. So good to know, but it's warm again now, which is nice. All right. The strawberries have cooked down, and what I'm looking for them for doneness. This is always when you burn yourself because you forget that the handles are still hot. Is that they are concentrated. There is a fair amount of juice that's come off from them. So I would probably put this back onto the stove top just to reduce it down. It smells nice and tart and vinegary. It's got some sweetness to it. So I'm just going to go ahead and scoop these right into the center. And you can do this if you want to display it on the table as a whole thing. Excuse me. Or you can take it out and cut it. So I'm going to save some of these back. And this is about a pound of fruit, which when I was measuring it out, and I remember this from the recipe testing, it felt like way too much. but you can see I could definitely add all of that fruit to that center. And so you can present it at the table like that. And I like to just top it with a little bit of powdered sugar. And this is just some powdered sugar that's in like a tea ball. And it makes a nice way to kind of get through that powdered sugar over the top. So this you could bring to a table and just serve it, and people can kind of tear it and pull off pieces, things like that, really like hands-on and comforting in that way. Or I'm gonna bring a cutting board. Hey, Zuma, Zuma. Sorry, my dog is here. Zuma, it's just a deer. We have a very active deer population, and our dog really likes to be sure that they do not come in the yard. So this is her evening activity. She gets her evening sprints in. All right, so a cutting board. And like I said, there's 3 tablespoons of butter in the pan when it goes in, which makes it really nice that it never sticks no matter what. At least that I've ever found. And so you can slide it right out of the center. Take your knife and just cut right through the center. And you could cut this into 8s or into 6s, depending on the size and hunger level of your group. And then you can take it and just put it onto a regular salad plate. And again, spoon some of those strawberries over the top and a little bit of that powdered sugar. And the powdered sugar isn't necessary. It just makes it look kind of finished to me in a restaurant-y way. It just looks like there's something kind of finishing that crust. This would also, I would not be upset if I were served this with some whipped cream, or I really love taking sour cream and just whisking it like whipped cream. It won't get as fluffy as that, but it will lighten some. And then you have that like tang and creaminess from the sour cream. You can do that with mascarpone or something like a ricotta cheese, also works well. I have definitely been in a pinch before and used cottage cheese for stuff like this. And I mean, I grew up having cottage cheese and pears as a dessert pretty often. I don't love the texture now, but there are some really well-made cottage cheese that are very creamy and luscious. And so any sort of richness like that is going to be great with a Dutch baby. So that's what I've got for you. I'm turning my oven on. So what questions have come up?
Well, it looks delicious. We have a lot of questions coming in. Someone wanted to know, you talked because you had been using frozen strawberries. Oh, would the process for using fresh strawberries, like when it's in season, be any different?
I think it's just about the same. Keep them, you can cut them in half if you want to, but otherwise I keep them whole, put them into the roasting pan, let them sear, put them back in the oven. And then if there's extra liquid, you can kind of taste it. And if it feels like it could be stronger, like either sweeter or a little bit thicker in texture, just put it on your burner and that will reduce it. Just like how if you're making, something similar to that, any sort of like pan sauce, or when you make gravy, like with a pot roast or something, it cooks and it has all of that liquid, and then you take the meat out, put the liquid back on the stove and bring it down, and you're doing the same thing, and it's just going to take less time because there won't be as much of that gravy.
Sounds good. Thank you. We have another person in the chat wanted to know, does opening the oven door when you put the strawberries in, will that affect the rise of the Dutch baby or not at all?
No, it's not like the souffle in that way. And even souffles, I have found, I'm not a super graceful person, and so I don't tend to open and close the oven in perfect whisper quiet. I have only ever found the oven door thing affecting a souffle if you leave it open long enough that you're losing the heat, or if you slam the door shut, that it's going to break all of those bubbles. And in the way that the two are different, souffle and Dutch baby, is that there is far more flour in the Dutch baby. And so you're getting the structure from the gluten in the flour that's going to hold its shape. So similar to bread, what's happening is that the bread, when it hits the oven, it springs up and then it sets because of that gluten creating the structure. In the souffle, you have a lot more egg than you do flour. I think my souffle recipe is like 4 eggs and maybe a 1/4 cup of flour. This was 3 eggs and a 1/2 cup of flour. And so because there's far less flour in it, you're really counting on the egg protein that is going to souffle when it hits the heat to hold that structure. So it's the same, scientifically the same thing, in that a protein is setting in the presence of heat, but it is gluten versus egg protein. And gluten proteins are much stronger. So they're going to hold their shape much more so. It's sort of like this one that we cut into ahead of time. You know, while it has shrunk a little bit, you can see, I don't know if you can see on the video screen, it still has like a nice curve to the crust here. And that is something that wouldn't happen with a souffle.
Thank you. We have Marianne says that it looks absolutely delicious, but they wanted to know if there is any way to tell like when the Dutch baby is done versus like the timing, like what are the key factors we should be looking for?
That's a great question, because every oven is different, every pan is different, you know, and it really what you're looking for is, I had a chef one time where I said, well, how do I know when it's done? And they said, or like, when will I pull it out of the oven? Well, when it's done. So yeah, what are the hallmarks of that? What I'm looking for is for it to be universally set, a nice bit of golden browning. I'm going to bring this other one back over and you'll see it. And I think this one actually turned out better than the first one that I did earlier today. You're looking for, if you see any sorts of raw batter, you know, so the golden brown, like you can see how dark brown that is. Don't be shy about baking your pastries dark. This is sugar that is caramelizing, and so you're going to get that little bit of bitterness, sweetness, all of it together. And it's just like a warmer, it's like the difference between having like toasty, delicious homemade bread and like those really crappy rolls that you get at a continental breakfast at a hotel that, like, you know, really were only baked like 80% of the way. So let it bake a little bit longer. If you see any sort of raw batter, let it keep going. These will have little pools of butter in them, and that's okay. That's different than the batter, and you'll be able to tell the difference because the batter is opaque. The butter will be translucent because at that point it's all melted butter. So I would say golden brownness, no raw batter anywhere near it, and that'll mostly be in the center of it or in the corners, wherever it has a chance to kind of cool. And then also I would say, because of the 3 tablespoons of butter that go into the pan, if the Dutch baby doesn't move freely within the pan, like even this one is up and over the edge like this, and I can still turn it very easily. That means that the entire thing is set because it has released. And this is something that's similar to, people always ask, like, how do I sear or grill fish without it sticking? The key is really let it cook, because what's happening is that when something like fish, especially if you have like beautiful salmon that still has the skin on it, blot that dry so that you don't have extra steam in it, because the steam will make it soggy. Put it into the pan and then let it just sit for a little bit. And the first chef that I cooked for in London after cooking school would say the fish should be willing to move of its own volition, which I feel like is only something an English person can say and not be laughed at. But you could nudge it with the edge of a spatula and the fish would move freely. She's like, if it doesn't move, it's not done. And really, you can cook fish or even like a chicken breast entirely on one side, and then you can just flip it at the last minute to get that extra little bit. So you're allowing that browning, and all of those proteins that are in that skin or on that edge are seizing as they tighten, as they cook. and they're going to pull back from the pan itself. And so if they haven't done that, then they're not going to move. Also using enough fat in your pan. I know, like, I grew up in kind of the low fat era. An extra, teaspoon of oil might be the difference between your fish sticking or not. And again, blotting it dry. That's different than the Dutch baby, which is a batter. There's no way to blot a batter dry. So you've got a nice little bit of fat, that screaming hot pan, putting it in and then leaving it undisturbed. Once it moves a little bit, it's cooked through on the bottom because it won't slide. It's sort of like if you're making like scrambled eggs, you can see how the outside of the pan sets usually kind of first. And then when you go to stir it, like everything pools out from underneath. Similar thing would happen if you were to stir the Dutch baby batter. So just let it cook as kind of one unit. Again, long-winded answers for you today.
So helpful. And I know we have people in the comments that are really enjoying it because it breaks it down for them and for all of us, really. We have a few other questions coming in before we wrap up. So if you have any questions, please make sure to leave them in there. We'll try to get through these ones. Karen would like to know, just could you say again, I know you said it before, but what type of oil you prefer for the pan of strawberries? Is there a preference? Is there one?
I tend to use grapeseed. So I have two oils next to my stove at all times. I have a cooking oil, which is also known as a high heat oil or neutral oil. I tend to use grapeseed because I find it to be, it doesn't have any flavor. It has a high smoke point, and it's not corn or soy, which are grown in monocultures in our area. And I don't love that practice of farming. So it's nice to have an outlet for this other ingredient. So I use grapeseed oil. You could use like rice bran oil, but also like canola oil, rapeseed, and also use a vegetable oil if you want to. It's the same idea. And then an olive oil. And my olive oil, the one that's by my stove, is not the like $40 bottle of olive oil that is really should just be poured over ice cream and that's it, or over bread, at the very beginning of dinner. I like to use like a kind of mid-range olive oil. I tend to use something like Colavita or something like that that has a nice olivey flavor. That flavor is basically what makes it not be a high heat because it hasn't been filtered in the same way. So there's more things in it to catch. And so it does smoke sooner. So it's not great for this because that pan is so hot. Like even me putting the grapeseed oil in it, because that pan had been in the oven for, going on 45 minutes at this point, it immediately started to smoke. So if it had been olive oil or something like a walnut oil, it would have just been like, you wouldn't have even been able to see me because it would have been so smoky. So those are the two that I have by my table. And I also realized I just told you to pour olive oil over ice cream, which is truly one of my favorite combinations. And I'll show you one of my favorite recipes in the book. And this is how simple cooking with fruit can be. In the melon chapter, my family would have just a ton of vanilla ice cream all summer. And then we would make fruit sundaes. So this is a melon that's stuffed with vanilla ice cream. And then you just pour that like sort of fancier fruity olive oil or even a peppery olive oil over it. That gives it a little bit of bitterness and a little bit of richness and that kind of fruity flavor. A little bit of salt, a little bit of black pepper. And what that is the salt is contrasting the sweetness in the ice cream and the sweetness in the melon and kind of accentuating all of those flavors. The black pepper is also contrasting the sweetness and the creaminess of the ice cream and the sweetness of the melon and giving it that little bit of heat. So it's similar if anybody's ever had like spicy hot chocolate or like chocolate that has chilies infused in it. This is kind of a less intense version of that. And I just love it. And I've been pouring olive oil over panna cotta, yogurt in the morning. I just love that combination of it. And I think that's the other thing too, is even though these are mostly sweet recipes in the book, there's always like a benefit that you get from incorporating some of the lessons of savory cooking, which is that acidity, a little bit of salt, a little bit of heat, and just kind of balance that you're aiming for.
That
That
sounds
sort of makes it
amazing.
sound complicated, but it's just about tasting it too. And some of these flavors, it takes a while to get comfortable with them. And so, try a little bit. And if you don't like it, it's okay. You're not going to offend me. I'm not in your kitchen with you. But I do think it can kind of open up some other flavors too.
Well, speaking of savory, we actually had a question in the chat. Miranda would like to know, do you have any current favorite savory recipes from Pulp? She loves the idea of bringing fruit into more savory dishes. Do you have some you'd recommend?
Yes, it's just the start of our rhubarb season. I don't know if you guys have rhubarb yet, but we have had a very weird spring. And so we are just getting into rhubarb. And what I've been doing with it lately is I poach it. So I just take some water, sometimes some white wine or cider, something like that. And then maybe a little bit of honey and poach it in that until it's tender. And then I've been serving that with pork chops. I grew up in like a family that would have pork chops and applesauce all the time. And so it's the same kind of combo. It's just with rhubarb, which again has that tartness to it. And then the recipe in the book has it with spinach and a rye spetzel or spätzle or spätzle, depending on how authentically German or Austrian you are, is those little tiny dumplings. And the recipe I got from Chef Paul Verant, who I worked for a long time. And it is like some sour cream, some flour, some eggs, and you beat it all together to make a dough, and then put it through a colander or through a spätzle maker and just poach these little tiny dumplings. And I like to make it with a little bit of rye flour because that adds kind of a nuttiness to it and the nice pretty color. And then you can have it just as a fresh kind of noodle in that way, or you can make it ahead of time and then pan fry it after the pork chops come out of the pan. So I usually make the rhubarb in big batches. It just lives in my fridge. And then I'll pan fry a couple of pork chops, take them out and let them rest. And while they are resting, I'll add the spätzle to the like pork drippings in the frying pan. It will crisp up and brown. So it'll be crunchy and brown on the outside and then really soft and tender and creamy on the inside. And I'll spoon that, kind of takes the place of like rice or mashed potatoes or something. And then the pork chop, the poached rhubarb, and then like a spinach salad on the side, because we always have spinach and rhubarb at the same time. Next time I'm just gonna say yes or no.
No, it's
20 minutes.
no, I was just waiting for the closing announcement to stop before I came back. But no, that sounds so good. We have people messaging on the side that says that they wish they could have that right now. But I think I think one of the things I thought was so fascinating about the book is just the combination of like I feel like my first thought when you hear cooking with fruit is just sweet.
Mhm.
And then to highlight all the different ways you can incorporate it into savory dishes is, to me, it's not something that I would have immediately thought of. And that's what makes it so exciting, and how many different ways you can do it, which is just astonishing.
That's how I feel too. And I say in the book, abundance, we grow so much fruit in Michigan that we always have a ton of it around. And, while necessity is the mother of invention, sometimes so too is abundance. And so, when you have a lot of something, you can kind of taste it, think about what other flavors it brings out for you, and then just give it a shot. We do that with bananas and stuff like that too, things that I don't have as much experience with.
Yeah. Marianne just wrote that she's looking forward to the book even more, especially after hearing that savory recipe.
Oh, wonderful. So good.
You really sold it. We do have, before we leave for tonight, which I just want to thank you again so much, Abra, for joining us. This has been so delightful and so educational, which is always it's just exciting to learn. We have, make sure to check out, I put the link again if you'd like to purchase Pulp and from our local independent bookstore, The Learned Owl. We also, they have Abra's other books. If you're looking for Grist or Ruffage, they're also there. And I again put the link for Grainer Farm in the chat. So if you're interested, that's all of there. But we do have one final question, which I think is a good one to end on. Wendy would like to know, do you have any plans for another cookbook? She recommends soups.
You know, it's funny you say that. There's no other current plans for a book. And I feel after putting out 3 books in 4 years, like I'm taking a little bit of a break just to catch up. But I also love doing this work. And so the fact that people are interested and want to have another book from me is like such a thoughtful thing. And soups have come up, and I love soup. And I feel like it's another sort of like perfect part of the practical guide series, because there's like creamy soups, there's chunky soups, there's cold soups, you know, there's all sorts of different techniques that you can do. And like soup is just, I mean, somebody said to me the other day that they're not a soup person. And I was just like, I don't even know what that means. You know, I don't like what it was, who doesn't have soup sometimes, you know, and like maybe I'm not always into, you know, like really thick soups or something like that, but like a tomato soup is always good. So Wendy, I
Know
will keep
someone
that in
that's
mind. The other things people have asked for is like a breakfast cookbook, cooking with fish, and a couple of things like that, like a Wednesday night meals book, but that's about as far as I've gotten. So thanks. If anybody has any other like ideas or things that they would love to see more books on, I'm on social media. Most of my things are Abra Berens. And then my email is just berens.abra@gmail.com. It takes me sometimes a little while to get back to folks, but you can always message me, and I'll do my best. And I would love to hear what you're interested in having written next.
Well, thank you again, Abra. This has been so delightful, and we were just so honored to have you join us this evening. Please make sure to check out her books. All 3 of them are amazing, and they break it down for you in such a fantastic way. Again, you can purchase Pulp from the Learned Owl, and thank you all for joining us this evening, and have a great night.
Thank you, Alex. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good night, everybody.